Hey guys, tonight we begin with the utterly questionable hygiene habits of the Victorian era. A time of top hats, corsets and diseases, with names that sound like rejected Harry Potter spells. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up to the gentle morning aroma of mould, stale air, and a distant whiff of manure from the street below. It's the Victorian era, which means your bedroom doubles as a fog chamber, and your mattress has more hay than a horse stable. You slept fully clothed, of course. Not because you're cold, but because undressing daily feels like something only aristocrats or actors might do. Your sheets haven't been washed in months, but you comfort yourself knowing that neither have anyone else's. That itchy sensation on your shoulder. Probably a flea. Or a spider. Or your imagination, which has learned to itch on cue. You sit up, stretch, and immediately inhale a cloud of coal dust. Your fireplace has been off all night, but soot is a constant companion, like a loyal dog, but less helpful and more respiratory. You glance in the mirror. Your hair resembles a bird's nest, if the bird had rage issues and access to bacon grease. There's a pitcher of water on the washstand, covered with a thin film of mystery. You splash some on your face. It's cold enough to question your life choices. Your skin tightens, your eyebrows freeze, and your paws, already struggling, wave the white flag. You reach for the towel. It's stiff, smells like last week's porridge, and might qualify as a blunt weapon. You pat yourself dry, which mostly means redistributing the dampness. Technically, you've washed. Spiritually, you feel like a slightly cleaner chimney sweep. Outside your window, the city groans to life. Horse hooves clop through excrement-slick streets. Chimney smoke curls lazily into already filthy skies. And someone down the lane is coughing up what you can only assume is a Victorian lung. You look down at your hands. The dirt under your fingernails has tenure. The ring of grime around your neck is no longer dirt. It's an accessory. And yet, you're ready to face the day. Because in this world, hygiene isn't about feeling fresh. It's about surviving until the next outbreak of cholera, and doing it with just enough soap to fool polite society. Welcome to the morning routine. You've never felt more Victorian. Bathing, in theory, is a noble pursuit. In Victorian reality, it's suspicious at best and dangerous at worst. Your doctor insists that overwashing weakens the soul. Your aunt whispers that water opens the pores to demons. You nod politely while silently deciding to go half courageous today, the infamous sponge bath. You stand before your wash basin like a soldier facing a duel. The sponge, stiff, tired, and vaguely bread-like, floats in a bowl of slightly cloudy water. You didn't boil it because firewood is for soup, not luxury. The water smells faintly of iron, dust, and possibly something that once lived in the well. Perfect. You strip down just enough to retain plausible deniability. Should anyone burst into the room, you can still claim innocence. Nudity, after all, is a moral hazard. Cleanliness might be next to godliness, but you're hedging your bets with modesty. You dab the sponge to your face. Cold. Always cold. You gasp like a startled goose, then mutter something unholy. You wipe your neck, underarms, and, maybe, if you're feeling daring, your shins. Anything beyond that is considered private property. The sponge begins to smell like you. You try to ignore it, but it's undeniably alive now, holding secrets and sins from previous scrubbings. You dip it again and wring it out with the resigned strength of someone who knows this is the best they'll feel all week. You avoid mirrors during the process, partially for modesty, mostly because you don't want to see what clean looks like. Besides, the lighting is dim and forgiving, a blessing in an era when pores are classified information. Your hair? Untouched. That's a separate battle. Shampoo isn't invented yet, and your one bottle of tonic smells like turpentine with lavender ambitions. You pretend it's fine. By the time you finish, your towel is just as damp as your dignity. You've managed to freshen up the way a cat might, hesitantly, selectively, and under emotional duress. Still, there's a vague sense of pride. You are, by 1850s standards, glowing. Not because you're clean, but because your skin is reacting to the sponge like it was sandpaper dipped in regret. Well done. You're ready to face society. At least until Thursday. Your hair is no longer hair. It's a biome. When you remove your nightcap, a desperate attempt to contain the beast overnight, you're greeted by something between a haystack and a low-level thundercloud. You consider brushing it, but your brush is made of boar bristles and judgment. It's also shared between your entire household, including your uncle, your cousin, and possibly the dog. You attempt to run your fingers through your locks. You get about 2 inches in before something catches, probably a louse, or maybe an emotional memory. You pause. Decide to go around it. This is Victorian diplomacy. Avoid direct confrontation with things that bite. You haven't shampooed in weeks, possibly months. That's not unusual. Shampoo is a foreign French concept at this point, literally imported and only used by the wealthiest or the most suspiciously clean. Your usual hair product is a dab of bear grease, or if you're feeling decadent, castor oil. Your scalp is hydrated in the way an old wooden floor is, shiny but full of secrets. Washing your hair is a production. First, you have to heat water over the fire for 45 minutes. Then, you have to find a bowl big enough to catch the runoff, but small enough not to look like you're performing sorcery. You kneel awkwardly over the basin, your neck screaming, your dignity evaporating, and someone inevitably knocks on the door because they need the room to peel turnips. If you're a man, you keep your hair shortish and plastered with pomade, because that's what's fashionable. If you're a woman, you twist it into a bun large enough to store secrets, and hope no one asks how long it's been since it saw daylight. A curl here, a comb there, and a prayer to St. Hygiene, patron of impossible expectations. And the lice? Ah, yes, your loyal companions. Everyone has them. They're the unofficial pets of the 1800s. You scratch, they scurry. It's a dance now. You even name one of them. Gerald. You gaze into the mirror. Your hair gleams, not with cleanliness, but with the haunted shimmer of oil, smoke, and societal denial. And you sigh, knowing this is as good as it gets. You are not dirty. You are Victorian clean. Your mouth is a time capsule, one filled with secrets, sugar, and probably an early-stage abscess. In the Victorian era, dental hygiene is less of a routine and more of a series of bad decisions stacked on top of inherited trauma. You begin your day with what could generously be called a toothbrush, though it more closely resembles a tiny broom or a hedgehog on a stick. Its bristles are made from pig hair, stiffened with age and judgment. You dip it into a powder, a fine blend of chalk, charcoal, and whatever's left in your spice cabinet. Mint? Not quite. More like graveyard cinnamon. You scrub at your teeth cautiously, as if they might file a complaint. Because they could. Some of them are loose. One has already given up and chipped itself last week on a questionable potato. There is no floss, of course. If something's stuck between your teeth, you do what any self-respecting Victorian does. Ignore it until it fossilizes or you tongue it into submission. If it starts to hurt, you gargle with salt water or gin, depending on how much you value your sobriety that day. Should the pain become unbearable, say you're starting to see sounds, you consider visiting a dentist. But Victorian dentistry is a special flavour of horror. There are no numbing agents, no sterile rooms, just a stout man with forearms like tree trunks and a set of pliers that may or may not have last been used on horses. Extractions are done with speed, muscle and prayer. Fillings? Rare and rudimentary. Braces? You're hilarious. Toothpaste? Not commercially available until decades later. Whitening strips? Yes, in the sense that eating chalk technically lightens the teeth. You've learned to smile with restraint. Not for etiquette, but to avoid revealing that one molar that looks like a haunted relic from a medieval battlefield. Your breath? Well, it smells period-appropriate. And yet, you persist. Because everyone's in the same decaying dental boat. Nobles, peasants, poets, all sharing a collective toothache and pretending it's fashionable. You rinse your mouth with more water. Spit. Something solid lands in the bowl. You don't ask questions. You move on. Because in the Victorian era, your teeth aren't perfect. They're just present. You know what they say. When bathing is a quarterly affair, fragrance becomes a full-time job. You eye the bottle of cologne on your dresser. It's a cloudy amber liquid, sealed with wax, and labelled in an overly cursive font that might say Imperial Essence, or possibly Essence of Empire. Hard to tell. You pop the stopper and recoil slightly. The scent hits like a cavalry charge. Musk, turpentine, and a hint of regret. You pour a generous splash into your palm. The burn is immediate. Your paws scream. Your ancestors flinch in their graves. But you soldier on, dabbing it to your neck, wrists, chest, and, because you've already committed, armpits. The bottle promises notes of bergamot and sandalwood. In practice, it smells like a spice rack fighting a small fire in a leather shop. You step into the street, confident. People take notice, mostly by coughing and discreetly opening windows. Your scent announces your presence several seconds before you actually arrive. Dogs grow uneasy. Children ask questions. Flowers seem to wilt a little faster near you, but it's better than the alternative. Without cologne, you smell like damp wool, boiled cabbage, coal smoke, and existential fatigue. Cologne, on the other hand, allows you to smell like someone trying, and in the Victorian era, effort counts for everything. Cleanliness is aspirational. Fragrance is a political statement. Everyone wears something. If you're rich, it's imported from France and costs more than a servant's yearly wage. If you're middle class, it's something local with a label like Gentleman's Essence No. 9, as if there were 8 earlier, less successful attempts. If you're poor, you dab yourself with vinegar and bravely call it astringent. Unfortunately, more is never less. Victorians didn't believe in subtlety. A lady might wear so much rosewater she resembles a perfumed ghost. A man might douse himself in bay rum and ignite if he stands too close to the fireplace. You don't just apply scent, you arm yourself with it. As the cologne settles, the sting fades. The world doesn't seem too offended anymore. Your scent is part of the landscape now, somewhere between the stables and the apothecary. And sure, your eyes water a little, but that's just the aroma of ambition. You've finally caved. After weeks of subtle hints from your loved ones, like placing you downwind and speaking through handkerchiefs, you've decided to visit a public bath. The phrase public bath suggests civilization. Clean marble, perhaps a potted plant. In reality, it's a steamy dungeon, staffed by a man who looks like he eats soap for fun. You hand over your pennies, clutching your towel like a shield against the unknown. The air inside is warm, moist, suspiciously organic. You step into the main room, where strangers sit in large communal tubs. No one is talking, just the sound of occasional splashes and existential dread. The water is brownish, not from design, but from shared history. You choose a corner. The water slaps against your skin like it's punishing you for past sins. It's warm, yes, but not fresh warm. More like recycled body heat and ghost memories, warm. A man next to you hums while shaving his chest with a rusty straight razor. You do not make eye contact. You glance at the soap on the ledge. It is communal, hairy, possibly sentient. You lather cautiously. Every move feels too intimate. You wash under your arms while pretending no one else exists. A child cannonballs into the tub and receives a quiet scolding, not for hygiene reasons, but because he disturbed the floaters. When you're done, you reach for a towel. It's not yours. Yours was stolen 5 minutes ago. The one that remains is moist and smells like boiled wool and regret. You accept your fate. You dry yourself with it, slowly, like a man losing hope with each pat. Outside, the air hits your skin like rebirth. You're technically clean now, but spiritually? You're different. You have seen things, felt things, absorbed centuries of other people's decisions. You walk home in silence, your body tingling, your dignity 3 steps behind. You consider building your own tub, or giving up bathing entirely and embracing the scent of musk and melancholy like everyone else. The public bath did its job. You are clean. But at what cost? Freshly bathed, or at least thoroughly stewed. You return home and reach for your clean clothes. You use the term loosely. Clean, in the Victorian sense, simply means hasn't been worn in the last 3 days and smells less like soup. You peel off your towel and brace yourself for the full Victorian layering experience. First up, the undergarments. They're white. Or were, once, possibly during the Crimean War. Now they exist in a permanent shade of laundry uncertainty. They are stiff, scratchy, and somehow smell faintly of chimney. You step into your drawers, which feel like sandpaper leggings with ambition. Then comes the undershirt, a heavy cotton garment that weighs roughly the same as a small child, and will cling to your torso like a judgmental ghost for the next 12 hours. Next, socks. Wool. Always wool. because nothing says cozy like foot-based humidity. You jam your feet in, navigating the ancient hole near the toe with the finesse of someone who has accepted defeat but still wants to keep their dignity. Now, trousers. These are fresh, meaning someone else hasn't sat in them since Wednesday. You hold your breath and slide them on, hoping the buttons cooperate and the seams don't mutiny. They creak when you walk. You are wearing your pants into submission. Your shirt is a starched menace. It's practically armour. The collar alone could slice bread, and the cuffs have all the flexibility of a dried cracker. You button it up with the delicacy of a bomb technician. One wrong move and the fabric might retaliate. Then the waistcoat. Then the coat. Then the cravat. You are now wearing 5 layers, none of which breathe. Your movement is limited to polite nodding and small ceremonial gestures. You are not so much dressed as encased, and yet you are now presentable. By Victorian standards, you look respectable, smell mostly tolerable, itch in at least 3 places, and your lungs are still working, despite the tight cravat slowly reducing your blood flow to Victorian levels of productivity. You step out, ready to face the world. Uncomfortable? Yes. Unwashed? Not technically. Untouchable? Absolutely. But clean? Let's just say it's aspirational. There comes a time in every Victorian's day when nature calls, and you, like everyone else, pretend not to hear it. Toilet is not a word one says out loud. It's whispered, like a scandal or an inappropriate relative. The acceptable term is privy, which sounds just detached enough to imply the experience happens in some other reality, behind a hedge, next to a goose, and nowhere near your delicate sensibilities. Your home has a chamber pot. You know this. You've seen it lurking under the bed like a porcelain demon. It's got floral patterns on the outside because nothing says romance like relieving yourself into something covered in violets. You stare at it. It stares back. You decide, not yet. You consider the outdoor privy instead. It's out past the garden, which means a full expedition through mud, darkness, and the occasional catfight. The privy itself is a wooden box with a hole in it, more existential concept than actual facility. There's no seat, no privacy. Just you, the wind, and your thoughts, and the smell. Victorian plumbing is still mostly a philosophical debate. If you're lucky enough to have a flushing toilet, it's probably in a separate outbuilding and powered by sheer optimism. Most waste ends up in cesspools, which are emptied by the night soil men. Professionals who somehow sleep at night, despite their job description being both literal and horrifying. You try not to think about it. You try not to breathe through your nose. You hover above the seat like a startled goat. You regret every decision that led you to this moment. You finish quickly, efficiently, spiritually wounded. Back inside, you wash your hands, or at least wipe them vaguely with a damp cloth. Soap exists, but it's often saved for guests or Sunday best. Hygiene, after all, is more about presentation than practice. You tell no one what you endured. The privy is not discussed. No one asks, no one tells. It is a silent contract among all who survive it. You go back to your day. You drink less water. You clench, physically and emotionally. Because in the Victorian era, bravery isn't charging into battle. It's holding it in until Tuesday. At last, the day is over. You've survived questionable soap, shared bath water, a public privy, and underwear with the consistency of stale parchment. Now, you shuffle toward the one place meant for peace, your bed. Unfortunately, your bed has other plans. From a distance, it looks inviting, a soft pile of quilts and straw-filled promises. Up close, however, it's a battlefield. The sheets haven't been washed since Queen Victoria was merely Princess Victoria, and the mattress has the structural integrity of a soggy biscuit. You lift the blanket and immediately feel the familiar dread. The itching hasn't even started, but your body remembers. You lie down. The straw pokes your spine in 13 unique spots. You shift. The bed creaks like it's filing a complaint. Then, slowly, the night parade begins. First, the fleas. Bold, relentless, and slightly cocky. They operate in squads. One distracts your ankle while another ambushes your neck. You swat blindly, like a sleep-deprived conductor waving away an invisible orchestra. Then come the lice, the aristocrats of the insect underworld. They've set up a small but thriving community in your pillow stuffing. Occasionally they throw a banquet and you're the main course. You try to sleep, but your body is now a buffet. Somewhere between scratching and questioning your life choices, you remember your neighbour mentioning bedbugs. You thought he was exaggerating. You were wrong. They're real. They're here, and they are organised. The solution? Burn the bed. Move to the floor. Become nocturnal. Anything but this. But of course you do none of these things, because this is the Victorian era. Everyone's bed bites. Everyone's itchy. Complaining would just make you sound dramatic, and God forbid a Victorian be dramatic. So you lie still, a noble sufferer in woolen pyjamas. Tomorrow you'll dust the sheets with chalk or vinegar or crushed mint, whatever your local apothecary recommends. Tonight you endure, eyes closed, skin crawling, pride intact. Sort of. Sleep eventually takes you, not because the bed is comfortable, but because your nervous system gives up. You dream of modern mattresses, and showers, and anti-itch cream. But for now, welcome to Victorian bedtime. You, the bugs, and a symphony of scratching. Ah, bath day. Singular, weekly, ceremonial. The event is scheduled with the solemnity of a royal coronation and the practicality of livestock management. You are not just taking a bath. You are part of a complex rotation system involving water, logistics, and questionable family intimacy. The tub is metal, oval, and cold enough to trigger philosophical questions about mortality. It sits in the middle of the kitchen like a small ship of shame. Water is hauled by hand from the stove, which has been boiling since dawn. After several pots and several minor back injuries, the tub is full. Warm. Mostly. You do not go first. That honour belongs to father, because he works hard and is head of the household, which apparently grants first dibs on the only vaguely clean water of the week. You go somewhere around fourth. By the time it's your turn, the bathwater has reached a complex level of opacity. It resembles weak tea left in a puddle. There's a distinct film on top, like the skin of old pudding. You try not to disturb it, but it follows you, like shame, only warmer. You disrobe behind a towel held up by your sibling. You hope they're not looking. They are. You step in. The water is tepid, the bottom slimy, and you instantly regret being born in the 19th century. You scrub quickly with the shared bar of soap, a gritty block that doubles as exfoliant, disinfectant, and psychological trauma. There's a hair on it. You pretend it's yours. It isn't. Then you rinse, which means awkwardly dumping ladles of slightly cleaner water over your head and hoping gravity is feeling generous today. There is no shampoo. Your scalp is now lemon-scented despair. Afterward, you dry off with a communal towel. It is damp. From everyone. It smells like sorrow. You dab, not rub, to avoid soaking up someone else's childhood. You get dressed behind the same towel. Your sibling makes faces. You try not to cry. And that's bath day. Next week, you might go third if your brother gets caught swearing again. In the meantime, you rely on cologne, denial, and praying for indoor plumbing to become trendy. You wake up sneezing. Possibly from the dust. Possibly from the flea bites. Possibly from the air itself, which seems to be composed of equal parts coal soot and passive-aggressive fog. You consider seeking medical advice, not because you believe it will help, but because it's either that or crawl into your straw mattress and become one with the bedbugs. Enter the Victorian doctor, a man with magnificent sideburns and exactly zero understanding of germ theory. He looks at your pale, slightly rash-covered face and nods wisely. Ah yes, he says, humours. Then he prescribes something vague like fresh air or less excitement, as though your body has simply chosen to misbehave out of boredom. You mention that you haven't bathed in a while. He raises an eyebrow. You don't want to overdo hygiene, he warns. Water opens the pores, which invites illness. Dirt, on the other hand, dirt is nature's barrier. He says this while stirring mercury into a tonic. You drink it. You're not sure why. Next, he suggests a bloodletting. It's not because you're bleeding, it's because you're not. Apparently, balance must be restored through leeches or a knife, depending on how festive he's feeling that day. You politely decline. He frowns and recommends opium instead. It's not all bad. He offers you a small bottle of laudanum and tells you to take as much as feels right. You'll either feel nothing or everything. Either way, you'll stop complaining about your cough. You ask about soap. He chuckles like you just proposed witchcraft. Over-cleanliness, he explains, weakens the constitution. He pats you on the shoulder, leaving a small soot print. A little grime toughens the spirit. You leave the office 2 pounds poorer and 6 ounces more confused. Back home, You stare at your filthy hands. You want to wash them. You also don't want to be labelled as hysterical or French. So instead, you sit by the fire and sip your opium tonic, which tastes like despair and raisins. Your nose is still running, but now you don't care. Because in Victorian Britain, the cure was often worse than the disease, but at least it came in a charming little bottle. You awaken, peel the blanket from your face, and are immediately greeted by that familiar, unspoken truth. You are still wearing the same undergarments you had on last Sunday. In Victorian England, this isn't a personal failure. It's standard protocol. Underwear, or as your governess politely calls it, unmentionables, are not washed with the frequency of, say, gilt or curtains. Changing them weekly is considered proactive. Twice a week, suspiciously French. You own exactly 3 sets. One is currently being boiled in lye water, the second is drying stiffly on the line like a surrendered ghost, and the third, oh yes, you're wearing that one now. It's made of wool. Not soft wool. Not the good kind. No, this is the itchy, commitment-heavy wool, designed to outlast empires and permanently etch itself into your thighs. Your shirt is buttoned up to the neck. Your drawers tied around the waist with a cord that's either too loose or actively cutting off circulation. Elastic hasn't been invented yet, and comfort is still considered morally questionable. By midweek, your underthings begin to take on a distinct scent. Not you exactly. More like wet candle meets cellar, with a whisper of despair. You briefly consider a change, but are reminded that laundry requires soap, water, time, and a servant willing to wrestle your linens like a biblical plague. Instead, you freshen up by sprinkling talcum powder in strategic regions and pretending that counts as progress. Ladies fare no better. Corsets are rarely removed, chemises rarely washed, and bloomers are ceremonial at best. The layers trap heat, secrets, and a thriving ecosystem of their own. You go about your day slightly itchy, vaguely damp, and deeply aware of your Victorian reality. You shift from foot to foot like a guilty schoolchild. You pray for a breeze and curse buttons. Eventually, Sunday comes again, laundry day, and you rejoice. You shed your woolen burden, toss it into the basin, and watch as the water turns the colour of weak tea and Victorian gilt. And as you hang your fresh pair on the line, you whisper a silent vow. Next week, you might change them early, but you won't. You thought you were safe. You don't drink from the Thames. You wash occasionally, with purpose. You even avoid stepping in puddles that look like they might fight back. And yet, here you are, coughing like a Dickens character, shivering under 3 blankets and wondering how it all went wrong. Let's go back. It began, innocently enough, with a stroll past an open sewer. In Victorian London, drains are not beneath the city so much as woven through it like a malevolent ribbon. Wastewater, human runoff, and whatever died upstream all leisurely swirl together in what the authorities generously call effluent. You call it death soup. Now, you don't have a modern sink. You have a basin and a bucket system, which, by design, delivers its contents back to the ecosystem in the least hygienic way imaginable. Indoor plumbing is still a risky fantasy, like unicorns or honest politicians. Your street smells faintly like boiled feet and mouldy toast. This is normal. But one hot summer afternoon, the smell becomes bold, assertive. Like the drain is staging a revolution. You ask a neighbour about it. He shrugs and says, "Ah, the miasma's back." Then he returns to eating bread with his bare hands. By nightfall, the fever starts. You blame your weak constitution. The doctor blames your humours. The sewer, of course, blames nothing. It simply continues to belch cholera into the air like it's doing God's work. You lie in bed, sweating through your 3rd set of clean sheets this week, while someone boils cabbage downstairs, presumably as an act of psychological warfare. Eventually, you're informed you've got Victorian stomach, which is less of a diagnosis and more of an accusation. Remedies include chalk, laudanum, and thinking happy thoughts. Public health doesn't yet exist. The concept of disinfecting anything, hands, water, drains, is still controversial. Some believe cleanliness is too clean. Others argue that God personally curates who gets dysentery. You survive. Barely. But every time you hear a suspicious gurgle near the gutter, you shudder. Because in Victorian Britain, the sewage doesn't just flow through the streets, it flows through you. You need a trim. And not just a spiritual one. Your hair has begun to take on a life of its own. Part scarecrow, part unpaid chimney sweep, and so you do what any respectable Victorian citizen would do. You go to the local barber, which is also the local dentist, and possibly the town's only bloodletter, amateur surgeon, and casual leech wrangler. You enter the shop and are immediately hit with a smell that can only be described as warm iron and old disappointment. There are no sinks, no sprays, no polite small talk about holidays. Just one chair, a basin full of something suspicious, and tools that look like they've recently been used to remove a limb. Because they have. You sit. The barber, wearing an apron stained with both history and secrets, greets you with a nod. Not a warm nod. More of a, this won't take long unless something goes wrong, kind of nod. He sharpens his blade. Not a metaphor. A literal blade. Before cutting your hair, he offers to yank a molar, just in case it's been acting up. You politely decline. He shrugs, as if you're the one being reckless. The haircut begins. No scissors, just a straight razor and firm Victorian confidence. There's no mirror. You'll only discover the results when someone either faints or salutes you out of respect. Your ears are narrowly missed. Twice. He wipes the blade on his sleeve, and you try not to think about how many other heads, or mouths, it's seen today. Halfway through, a man stumbles in, clutching his jaw. Toothache. The barber turns to address him, gesturing toward the same chair you're still sitting in. You make eye contact with a set of pliers and realise you may not survive this haircut with all your teeth intact. Eventually it's over. Your hair is shorter, uneven, slightly resentful, but at least you're not bleeding from anywhere new. You hand over a few coins and step out, windswept and mildly traumatised, as the next patient takes your still warm seat. And as the barber lights a pipe using a rag soaked in gin, you wonder, was the haircut free, or was the tetanus complimentary? It's the end of a long day filled with soot, horse manure, and mysterious street puddles that hiss when disturbed. You remove your boots with a crowbar and gaze longingly at the basin. You know what must come next. Soap. Well, soap. Victorian soap is not so much a cleansing product as a threat with a pleasant smell. It's made of lye and animal fat, mixed by someone's aunt who claims to have a gift. It's hard, yellowish, and crumbles like guilt. There are no scents, only chemical aftershocks. You pick it up. It stares back. The first touch on your skin feels like a warning. The second feels like penance. Your hands sting. Your face tightens like it's about to crack open and confess your sins. Still, you scrub. You once heard of a man in Bath who used too much and lost feeling in his chin for a week. They called him Smooth Eddie. No one's seen him since. Soap this century is not for pampering. It's a battlefield between grime and epidermis, and neither comes out whole. You try not to get it near any sensitive areas. You made that mistake last month and saw God briefly. As the pain sears gently across your knuckles, you stare out the window and dare to imagine. What if there was soap that didn't make you feel like you were being judged by the sun? You picture a world where soap lathers with joy, not fear, where it smells like flowers and not boiled regret, a place where your skin doesn't scream in Morse code for mercy after each wash. You blink. The fantasy fades. You're back in your basin, scrubbing your armpits with what might be caustic lime, or possibly just a hardened wart. You aren't sure anymore. A cousin once told you about French soap. Supposedly, it's soft, creamy, and doesn't strip the soul from your body. But she also believes in ghosts and drinks perfume, so you remain skeptical. Still, you dream. Not of wealth, not of fame, but of soap that doesn't double as a medieval punishment device. Until then, you'll keep scrubbing, wincing, and praying to the gods of glycerin. Because in Victorian England, cleanliness isn't next to godliness, it's just closer to danger. Imagine living in the bustling heart of Rome, where the streets are noisy, cramped, and often filthy. Life for the majority of citizens, the plebeians, was far from glamorous. Many lived in crowded apartment blocks called insulae, with little ventilation, unreliable water, and the constant threat of fire. Food was expensive, work unstable, and the difference between the rich and poor was staggering. In such a volatile environment, anger could boil over into riots at any moment. The emperors knew this, and they devised a deceptively simple way to keep the masses quiet. Give them cheap bread to fill their bellies and grand entertainment to distract their minds. This was the political genius behind the phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses. It wasn't charity, it wasn't kindness. it was strategy. By distributing grain at subsidized prices, or sometimes for free, Roman rulers bought loyalty. Hunger was the quickest path to rebellion, but a full stomach made for a quieter crowd. Yet feeding the population alone was not enough. Rome needed spectacle. The emperors turned the city itself into a theatre, where politics played out not only in the Senate, but in arenas, amphitheatres, and circuses. The Colosseum, with its blood-soaked sands, became the beating heart of this system. Here, gladiators fought to the death, exotic animals clashed, and naval battles were staged in artificially flooded basins. The Circus Maximus, seating more than 150,000, roared with the thunder of chariot races, where fortunes could be won or lost in a single lap. These public entertainments weren't random amusements. They were carefully orchestrated tools of control, designed to captivate the masses and bind them emotionally to the emperor who gifted such experiences. Think of it as a psychological contract. The emperor provides food and spectacle, and in return the people grant him loyalty, or at least silence. Bread and circuses dulled the edge of dissatisfaction. Citizens distracted by games and feasts were less likely to question corruption, wars, or heavy taxation. For the ruling class, this formula was far cheaper than crushing uprisings or constantly bribing the army. In this way, Rome pioneered an early form of mass entertainment politics, keeping its vast, restless population under control not through constant fear, but through calculated indulgence. It was a bargain everyone understood. Eat, cheer, and forget your troubles. If bread was half the Roman promise, then the grain dole, the annona, was the machinery that made it possible. Rome was a city of more than 1 million people at its height, and unlike today's cities, it did not produce enough food to sustain itself. Grain had to be imported in staggering amounts from the provinces, first Sicily and Sardinia, later North Africa and Egypt, which became the empire's breadbasket. Without those shipments, Rome starved. With them, emperors kept the people firmly in their grasp. Every month, tens of thousands of eligible citizens lined up to receive their share of subsidized or free grain. This system was no act of generosity. It was survival politics. Julius Caesar had once tried to reduce the number of beneficiaries to cut costs, only to face backlash so fierce he abandoned the effort. Later, emperors learned the lesson. Tampering with the grain dole was political suicide. Better to bear the expense than risk riots in the Forum. The logistics alone were a marvel. Fleets of massive grain ships sailed the Mediterranean, timed with the sailing season to avoid winter storms. Harbours like Ostia bustled with activity. Warehouses overflowed with sacks of wheat, and an entire bureaucracy tracked quotas, deliveries, and distributions. The Roman state had essentially built a supply chain empire within an empire. Failure at any point, shipwreck, piracy, poor harvest, could spark unrest. Emperors took this so seriously that some even built granaries to stockpile reserves against famine. For the people, the grain dole was more than food. It was a visible reminder of Rome's wealth and their place in it. To stand in line and receive grain stamped with the emperor's mark was to feel part of something larger, part of a city whose rulers provided. It blurred the line between necessity and gratitude. The dole kept you alive, but it also bound you psychologically to the hand that fed you. And yet there was an unspoken truth. This bread was not meant to elevate the poor or give them dignity. It was meant to pacify them, to transform hunger into docility. Rome had learned long before that revolutions are not born from the well-fed. They are born from the starving. And so the grain dole became the empire's safety valve, releasing pressure before discontent could explode. While the poor of Rome queued for their grain ration, the wealthy dined like gods. Roman banquets, convivia, were not simply meals. They were performances of power, wealth, and cultural sophistication. To be invited to a senator's or equestrian's banquet was to step into a world of dazzling abundance, where food itself became a stage for politics and prestige. Guests reclined on couches arranged around low tables, following the Greek custom. Slaves hurried about with silver trays, pouring wine, wiping hands, or even holding sandals. The air was thick with the aromas of roasted meats, exotic spices, and incense. Musicians and dancers provided entertainment between courses, while poets and philosophers might be summoned to declaim verses or debate ideas, giving the evening an intellectual gloss. The food, however, was the true spectacle. Wealthy Romans prided themselves on serving rare and extravagant dishes that ordinary citizens could scarcely imagine. Peacock tongues, flamingo brains, stuffed dormice, and delicacies imported from the farthest reaches of the empire graced the tables. The rarer and stranger the food, the greater the prestige. Apicius, the legendary gourmet, once squandered a fortune on such pursuits, proving that in Rome, indulgence could be its own kind of madness. But banquets were more than gluttony. They were political currency. A successful feast built alliances, displayed a host's resources, and humiliated rivals. Senators might use banquets to court votes or reward loyalty. Ambitious men ensured their hospitality was whispered about the next day in the forum. Even emperors understood the power of the banquet. Augustus held modest but frequent dinners to appear approachable, while Nero revelled in debauchery, making feasting itself a tool of propaganda. Not everyone was impressed. Satirists like Juvenal mocked the decadence of the elite, contrasting their golden platters with the cracked bowls of the poor. Moralists complained that Rome had lost the simple virtues of its ancestors, trading discipline for excess. But the allure of the banquet was irresistible. To recline amid friends and rivals, drinking Falernian wine and watching gladiators or acrobats perform between courses, was to taste the empire's grandeur on your tongue. These banquets did not feed the masses, nor were they meant to. They fed ambition, ego, and political survival. Where bread pacified the poor, feasts fortified the powerful. Together, they formed two halves of Rome's great performance, one to soothe the belly, the other to dazzle the imagination. If bread fed the body, the arena fed the soul, though with violence, not nourishment. The Colosseum, Rome's grand amphitheatre, was the most famous, but hardly the only one. Across the empire, amphitheatres rose like temples to brutality, where the masses gathered not for prayer, but for blood. The spectacle of gladiatorial combat was at once thrilling, horrifying, and deeply political. Gladiators themselves were paradoxes, despised as slaves and criminals, yet adored as heroes. Some were prisoners of war, others condemned men, and a few even volunteered, seeking glory or the promise of prize money. Once inside the arena, however, status outside mattered little. What counted was courage, endurance, and the ability to make a crowd roar. The Romans had no illusions about the violence. They craved it. The clash of steel, the gush of blood, and the moment when a beaten man awaited the crowd's verdict were the very heart of the experience. But gladiatorial games were never just about sport. They were instruments of power. Emperors and politicians sponsored games to win favour, presenting themselves as generous patrons who gave back to the people. When the emperor gestured for mercy or death, he was not only deciding a man's fate, he was reminding the crowd of his supreme authority. Even the ability to sway the audience's cry of "spare him" or "kill him" was a subtle lesson in collective submission. The people felt powerful, but the emperor's hand still made the final call. The scale of these events was staggering. Days-long festivals featured dozens of fights, beast hunts, executions, and staged reenactments of famous battles. Exotic animals, lions, tigers, elephants, even hippos, were imported at immense cost, paraded before the people, and slaughtered for entertainment. Sometimes entire sets were constructed, forests, rivers, and fortresses built within the arena to stage epic spectacles. Rome prided itself on making fantasy into reality, no matter how bloody. For the audience, the arena was catharsis. In a world of poverty and inequality, citizens could revel in raw, unfiltered power. They could cheer for bravery, hiss at cowardice, and vent their frustrations in a collective frenzy. The games were cruel, but they were also unifying, binding Rome's fractured classes in a single shared spectacle. The Colosseum was more than stone arches and sand. It was a theatre of control, where bread filled the stomach, and blood filled the imagination. If gladiators embodied blood and death, the Circus Maximus embodied speed and frenzy. This massive racecourse, stretching nearly 600 metres, was the beating heart of Roman entertainment long before the Colosseum dominated the skyline. Seating more than 150,000 spectators, some estimates push it even higher, the circus was where Rome came alive in a deafening roar of hooves, wheels, and voices. The main attraction was chariot racing, a sport so dangerous and addictive that it rivaled gladiatorial games in popularity. 4 teams, the Reds, Blues, Greens, and Whites, competed with fanatical followings that would put modern sports clubs to shame. Citizens painted their homes in team colours, placed bets, and sometimes even rioted when results didn't go their way. These factions weren't just games of loyalty, they were political and social identities. To cheer for the blues or greens was to declare an allegiance that could spill into violence outside the circus walls. The races themselves were chaos on wheels. Teams of 2 or 4 horses pulled lightweight chariots around the central barrier, the spina, for 7 laps. Crashes were inevitable, and the Latin word for them, naufragia, shipwrecks, captures just how catastrophic they could be. Horses trampled men, chariots splintered, and drivers risked being dragged to death by reins tied around their waists. The more spectacular the accident, the louder the crowd cheered. Romans craved danger almost as much as victory. But beneath the spectacle lay politics. Like gladiatorial games, chariot races were tools of imperial propaganda. Emperors sponsored races, sat in prominent seats, and ensured the people associated their reign with thrilling entertainment. Victories could be framed as divine favour, losses blamed on rivals. When an emperor cheered alongside the people, it gave the illusion of unity, even as the empire was deeply divided by wealth and class. The Circus Maximus also doubled as a space for public ceremony. Triumphs, religious festivals, and imperial announcements unfolded there, ensuring that entertainment and statecraft were seamlessly intertwined. The people might think they were attending for sport, but they were also being reminded, subtly and not so subtly, of Rome's grandeur and the emperor's generosity. For the poor, the circus was a place where they could forget hardship. For the elite, it was a stage to display influence. And for the emperors, it was one of the most effective tools of mass control ever invented. The dust, the sweat, and the thunder of hooves weren't just sport. They were politics in motion. If daily bread and the occasional circus kept the Roman people content, then festivals turned contentment into euphoria. Rome's calendar was overflowing with public holidays, so many, in fact, that nearly half the year was marked by some form of religious or civic celebration. Far from being solemn affairs, these festivals blended ritual with revelry, creating a continuous rhythm of distraction for the masses. Saturnalia, perhaps the most famous, transformed the social order itself. Masters served slaves, gambling was permitted, and public drinking filled the streets with laughter and chaos. For a week, Rome pretended that hierarchy didn't exist, only for the old order to return even more firmly once the festival ended. Other festivals, such as Lupercalia, were wild fertility rites involving half-naked youths racing through the streets with whips, striking women who believed the blows promoted conception. To modernize, it may seem bizarre, but to Romans, it was sacred tradition wrapped in spectacle. Religious games like the Ludi Romani combined chariot races, theatrical performances, and gladiatorial combats, all dedicated to the gods. State-sponsored festivals reminded the people that their pleasures flowed directly from the empire's religious and political leadership. By blending piety with entertainment, emperors could claim divine sanction for their rule, while keeping the crowd enthralled. What made festivals so effective as tools of control was their sheer abundance. While other civilizations might have reserved feasting and public games for rare occasions, Rome practically scheduled distraction. By the imperial period, the calendar was packed with over 100 days of games and festivals each year. Imagine living in a world where nearly every third day offered a reason to skip work, gather with neighbours, and indulge in collective amusement. The psychological effect was profound. Festivals offered a release valve for the frustrations of poverty and inequality. They blurred the boundaries between classes, if only temporarily, as senators, merchants, and beggars all filled the same crowded spaces. The poor could forget hunger, the rich could parade their generosity, and the emperor could bask in the cheers of a grateful crowd. Festivals weren't just celebrations. They were orchestrated illusions of unity. They reminded Romans not only of the gods above, but also of the empire's vast resources and the ruler who made such abundance possible. In this way, joy itself became political theatre, and the empire learned that laughter and ritual could be as effective as legions in maintaining order. Every loaf of bread handed out, every race at the circus, and every gladiator match in the Colosseum carried a message. The emperor provides, the emperor protects, and the emperor deserves loyalty. Roman entertainment was never mere leisure. It was propaganda wrapped in spectacle. From the very beginning, rulers understood this. Julius Caesar, keenly aware of public opinion, staged games that bankrupted him but won him the hearts of the people. Later, emperors followed suit, escalating the grandeur until games became near-mandatory performances of power. Augustus used festivals to emphasize Rome's moral renewal under his leadership, while Nero revelled in excess to project divine favour and personal charisma. Even emperors who ruled with iron fists relied on the soft power of spectacle to legitimize their reign. The venues themselves were propaganda carved in stone. The Colosseum wasn't simply an amphitheatre, it was a monument to imperial generosity, built by Vespasian and Titus to show that the Flavian dynasty cared for the people. Its very existence reminded Rome that emperors could command resources, labour, and imagination on a colossal scale. Every time citizens filed through its arches, they walked into a living symbol of imperial authority. Inside, propaganda was woven into the games. Exotic animals from conquered lands paraded before the crowd, proof of Rome's global reach. Staged battles reenacted Rome's victories, ensuring that even illiterate peasants absorbed the message of imperial dominance. The emperor's presence was the climax. Seated in a special box, he was visible to tens of thousands, elevated both physically and symbolically above the masses. When he raised or lowered his hand to decide a gladiator's fate, it wasn't just about mercy or cruelty. It was a demonstration that life and death itself rested in his command. Even the sense of participation was manipulated. The crowd might cheer, boo, or demand mercy, but the emperor ultimately had the last word. This gave citizens the illusion of influence while reinforcing the reality of hierarchy. In essence, spectacles taught Romans to equate their well-being with the emperor's goodwill, ensuring loyalty without the constant need for force. Propaganda worked because it was entertaining. Citizens came for blood, laughter, and thrills, and left with reinforced faith in imperial power. Through spectacle, Rome perfected a political trick still used in every age. Keep the people dazzled, and they'll forget the chains that bind them. Not everyone in Rome was dazzled by the bread and circuses. Even as crowds cheered in the Colosseum or celebrated during Saturnalia, critics were raising sharp voices against the excess. To some, the endless feasts, races, and spectacles were not signs of Roman greatness, but of moral decay and dangerous dependency. Writers like Juvenal satirized the public's obsession with entertainment, coining the very phrase panem et circenses as a critique. He lamented that citizens had traded political engagement for cheap food and shallow thrills, caring little for liberty as long as they were fed and amused. To him, Rome's people had become spectators instead of citizens, surrendering their role in governance to chase after handouts and distractions. Moralists like Seneca echoed this disdain. The Stoic philosopher condemned the bloodlust of the arena, arguing that watching men slaughter each other corrupted the soul. Others worried that constant indulgence weakened Rome's military spirit, turning once disciplined farmers and soldiers into lazy dependents, waiting for their next ration or race. To these critics, the empire's strength was rotting from within, sacrificed to pleasure. Beyond morality, there were the financial costs. Hosting lavish games and maintaining grain supplies drained imperial coffers. Emperors like Trajan or Marcus Aurelius spent fortunes to stage festivals that lasted months. The importation of exotic animals, the construction of temporary sets, and the feeding of massive crowds all came at staggering expense. Grain shipments from Egypt and North Africa required fleets of ships, armies of administrators, and constant protection from pirates. One bad harvest or disrupted supply line could send Rome into crisis. Some emperors used the costs as political leverage. They reminded citizens that the state's generosity was not infinite, framing bread and circuses as gifts of imperial grace rather than rights. But once the expectation was set, it became impossible to undo. Attempts to reduce the dole or scale back games risked riots. In a way, emperors were as trapped as the people, bound to a system that kept peace only as long as the bread flowed and the spectacles dazzled. For the critics, this was the tragedy, a mighty empire enslaved by its own formula. Bread and circuses could pacify, but they could not inspire greatness. To them, it was proof that Rome's glory was being bought cheaply, and at a cost that would one day prove ruinous. The Roman formula of panem et circenses did not vanish with the empire. Its echoes ripple through history, shaping how rulers, governments, and even corporations manage public opinion. The idea is deceptively simple. When people are fed and entertained, they are less likely to question authority. Rome may have pioneered it, but the logic has proved timeless. After the fall of Rome, kings and princes across Europe sponsored jousts, festivals and public feasts to curry favour with their subjects. Bread may have given way to ale and roasted oxen, but the principle remained the same: lavish display as a substitute for deeper reform. In modern times, state spectacles, national parades, sports tournaments, fireworks shows continue the tradition of uniting populations under banners of distraction. Stadiums filled with roaring fans are not so different from the Circus Maximus, their passions channeled into safe, predictable outlets. The phrase bread and circuses has become shorthand for superficial appeasement. Politicians promise tax breaks, subsidies, or entertainment projects to keep voters satisfied, often sidestepping the harder questions of justice, inequality, or reform. Mass media, films, streaming services, and global sporting events extend the Roman tactic into the digital age, offering endless spectacle to occupy attention. While no modern leader would openly admit it, the strategy of distraction remains as potent as it was under Augustus or Trajan. But Rome's story also serves as a warning. Bread and circuses kept peace, but they did not prevent decline. The empire's people grew accustomed to handouts and constant amusement, while corruption hollowed out political institutions and economic strain mounted. Critics then, as now, argued that a society focused only on consumption and entertainment risks, losing the very virtues that sustain it: discipline, civic responsibility, and resilience. The legacy of panem et circenses is thus double-edged. On one side, it demonstrates the extraordinary power of mass entertainment to unify, distract, and pacify. On the other, it reminds us that distraction can be a dangerous substitute for genuine stability. Rome's rulers bought time with bread and games, but not eternity. Their empire eventually crumbled, leaving behind the lesson that spectacle can maintain control, but it cannot build lasting strength. When we watch a stadium roar, a screen flicker, or a government hand out promises, we are not so far from the crowds of the Colosseum. Rome may be gone, but its formula for control still lives on, quietly shaping the world around us. In ancient Rome, dining was never just about eating. It was a carefully staged performance. For the wealthy elite, meals became opportunities to flaunt power, display cultural refinement, and outshine rivals. To be invited to a banquet or convivium was to step into a world where food transformed into spectacle, and where the act of eating became a public statement about one's place in society. Guests did not sit on simple chairs, but reclined on couches arranged around low tables, following a Greek custom that Rome made its own. Slaves bustled about with polished trays, carrying delicacies or pouring wine, while others stood ready to wash hands or refill cups. Musicians plucked strings, dancers twirled, and poets recited verses, ensuring that the evening touched all the senses, not just the appetite. The room itself often glittered with marble floors, mosaics, and walls painted in rich colours, visual proof that the host could afford both luxury and artistry. But it was the food that stole the show. Roman hosts competed to surprise and dazzle, offering dishes that were not only rich in flavour but eccentric in concept. To serve something ordinary would have been almost insulting. To serve something rare, foreign, or bizarre, on the other hand, was to command awe. Flamingo tongues, dormice stuffed with herbs, or jellyfish seasoned with vinegar were not chosen for their nutrition. They were trophies, culinary proofs of wealth and reach. The rarer the dish, the greater the prestige of the host who served it. Banquets were not merely social events, they were tools of politics. Senators courted allies by hosting feasts that left guests speechless, while ambitious men used eccentric dishes to make their names remembered. An emperor's table became a stage where generosity was displayed for propaganda. Augustus famously kept his meals simple to emphasize his image of modest virtue, while Caligula and Nero veered into excess, serving food so lavish and strange that it shocked even the jaded Roman elite. For those lucky enough to attend, a Roman feast was an overwhelming experience. The scent of spices carried from distant provinces, the strange texture of unfamiliar meats, the sight of animals most had never seen alive. It was both a meal and a message, that Rome's wealth was limitless, its empire boundless, and its elite powerful enough to command even the rarest flavours of the known world. Among the strangest luxuries to grace Roman banquet tables were the tongues of flamingos. To modern diners, the idea sounds almost absurd, but in Rome, rarity was the point. Flamingos were exotic, difficult to hunt, and their tongues offered only a small bite of meat. That scarcity made them the perfect dish for aristocrats, eager to prove that no expense or eccentricity was beyond their reach. To serve flamingo tongue stew or roasted fillets was not about flavour, it was about prestige. Guests would gasp at the sight, whisper about the cost, and remember the host's name long afterward. Writers like Apicius, whose cookbook survives as one of the great culinary texts of antiquity, included recipes involving flamingos, often seasoned with sharp sauces of vinegar, honey, and spices. The emphasis was never on simplicity, but on transformation, turning the unfamiliar into something extraordinary. Flamingo tongues became a canvas on which Roman chefs painted with flavours imported from across the empire. Peacock dishes carried a similar weight of spectacle. The bird itself was rare and dazzling, a living symbol of majesty. At banquets, cooks sometimes served whole roasted peacocks with feathers reattached to create a theatrical centrepiece. But for those chasing extremes, it was the brains that mattered. Like flamingo tongues, peacock brains were valued for being delicate, elusive, and almost comically impractical. To kill a majestic bird for the sake of a spoonful of brain meat was the height of Roman eccentricity, and therefore the height of Roman elite dining. These dishes reveal how Roman dining culture equated extravagance with power. It wasn't enough to serve lamb, pork, or even fish, all common enough for any wealthy household. True status came from presenting foods that defied normality, that seemed impossible to acquire. In this sense, flamingo tongues and peacock brains were less about feeding the stomach and more about feeding the ego. Not everyone admired such excess. Satirists like Juvenal mocked Rome's obsession with bizarre dishes, painting elites as wasteful fools, more concerned with flaunting luxury than with taste or morality. Yet the popularity of these foods endured precisely because of their ability to shock and impress. For Roman nobles, a banquet without surprise was a wasted opportunity. And few surprises carried more weight than telling your guests, with a casual smile, that tonight's delicacy had once sung over marshes or strutted through palace gardens. If one dish symbolises the eccentric extravagance of Roman dining, it is the dormouse. These small, squirrel-like rodents, common across the Mediterranean, were transformed into culinary curiosities by the Roman elite. To the poor, they were vermin. To the wealthy, they were delicacies, fattened, stuffed, roasted or glazed until they resembled bite-sized luxury. Their presence on the banquet table was proof that a host belonged to the highest circles of Roman society. Dormice were not simply hunted, they were farmed with methodical precision. The Romans devised special terracotta jars called gliraria, complete with air holes and small ledges. Inside, dormice were provided with nuts, acorns, and chestnuts until they grew plump. Once suitably fattened, they were ready for the kitchen. The very existence of gliraria shows how normalized this practice was among the elite. Breeding rodents for feasting was not eccentricity, but a status tradition. The recipes were as varied as they were indulgent. Some dormice were stuffed with minced pork, pepper and herbs before being roasted. Others were coated in honey and sprinkled with poppy seeds, transforming them into sticky, sweet morsels. Apicius, the Roman culinary authority, included dormice in his cookbook without irony, placing them alongside peacock and flamingo as accepted banquet fare. For Roman palates accustomed to bold flavours, the dormouse was a canvas for culinary creativity. But beyond taste, dormice carried symbolism. They represented the empire's mastery over nature. Tiny creatures transformed from pests into prizes. They also embodied the Roman love of novelty. A banquet was judged not just by its abundance, but by its ability to surprise and delight. Dormice offered both. Guests could marvel at the absurdity of eating rodents, while savouring the skill with which they were prepared. Critics, of course, had their say. Moralists complained that Rome had descended from simple meals of bread and olives to indulging in rodents dipped in honey. Satirists mocked nobles who boasted of dishes that ordinary farmers would recoil from. Yet the practice continued for centuries, showing just how deeply novelty and spectacle were woven into Roman dining culture. For the guests reclining on couches, each sticky, honey-soaked dormouse was more than a bite of food. It was proof of belonging, a taste of extravagance, and a reminder that in Rome, even the smallest creatures could be transformed into symbols of immense power and wealth. The Romans had a fearless curiosity when it came to the sea. Beyond the familiar catches of fish and shellfish, they experimented with creatures most cultures ignored. turning the strange and slimy into culinary showpieces. Among the oddest of these were jellyfish and sea urchins, dishes that today might raise eyebrows, but which in Rome symbolised refinement, daring, and a palate unafraid of novelty. Jellyfish, with their gelatinous, translucent bodies, were hardly obvious food. Yet Roman cooks transformed them into delicacies by boiling the flesh and dressing it with pungent sauces made of vinegar, oil, pepper, and lovage. Apicius, the famous culinary writer, includes recipes for preparing jellyfish, suggesting they were not one-off experiments, but accepted items at elite tables. The texture was unlike anything else, slippery and unusual, which made it perfect for a host eager to surprise his guests with something exotic. To eat jellyfish was not about savouring flavour, it was about proving you were bold enough to taste the bizarre. Sea urchins, by contrast, had the allure of rarity. Harvested from rocky coasts, their spiny shells concealed a rich, briny roe that Roman diners considered a delicacy. The urchins were often cracked open raw and dressed with garum, Rome's ubiquitous fermented fish sauce. The salty oceanic taste was unlike the bland grains and vegetables that filled most diets. For the wealthy, offering sea urchins was a way to showcase connections to coastal provinces and the ability to transport fragile goods inland to Rome's feasting halls. Other marine oddities joined the Roman menu: cuttlefish, moray eels, and even small crustaceans seasoned with imported spices. Each carried the same message: Rome could bend nature to its will, drawing from the depths of the Mediterranean and beyond to please its citizens. The more unexpected the dish, the greater the prestige of the host who served it. To ordinary Romans, struggling on bread and porridge, the thought of eating jellyfish or sea urchins was unimaginable. These foods were symbols of exclusivity, accessible only to those with wealth and influence. To the elite, however, they were proof that Rome's reach had no limits. Even the ocean's strangest creatures could be harvested, prepared, and placed on the banquet table. For the diners reclining in candle-lit tricliniums, tasting a jellyfish dressed in spice or scooping roe from a cracked urchin shell was not merely a culinary experience, it was a declaration. Rome could conquer not just land and people, but the very strangeness of the sea itself. If strange meats and sea creatures impressed Roman diners, spices completed the performance. To season a dish with flavours from distant lands was to announce that your wealth and influence extended across continents. Pepper from India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, frankincense from Arabia, and even silphium, an herb so prized it was harvested to extinction, poured into Rome along vast trade routes. The empire devoured them eagerly, transforming humble ingredients into luxurious banquets. Pepper was the undisputed king of Roman spices. Black peppercorns travelled thousands of miles along caravans and across the Red Sea to reach Roman ports. By the 1st century CE, Rome imported tons of it each year, enough that Pliny the Elder grumbled about the empire's gold draining eastward just to satisfy taste buds. To sprinkle pepper on flamingo tongues or honey-glazed dormice was to elevate the dish into a global statement. The empire could command the farthest reaches of the earth for the sake of flavour. Cinnamon, too, held an aura of mystique. Roman authors spun elaborate tales about its origins, imagining giant birds guarding the spice, or it being collected from treacherous cliffs. In truth, it came from South Asia, traded through Arabian merchants who deliberately obscured its true source to maintain high prices. For Roman diners, cinnamon carried not just sweetness, but an exotic story. Every bite was a reminder of how far Rome's reach extended. Then there was silphium, a plant native to North Africa, used as both spice and medicine. Its flavour was so beloved, and its rarity so great, that Roman gourmets described it as essential for the finest cooking. Over-harvested to extinction, it became a legend in itself, proof that Rome's hunger could consume even nature's rarest treasures. When silphium vanished, its memory lingered in Roman texts as a symbol of culinary extravagance lost forever. For the poor, spices were distant luxuries, smelled in street markets but rarely tasted. For the wealthy, they were tools of theatre. A sprinkle of pepper or dash of cinnamon turned a banquet into an empire on a plate. It wasn't just about taste, it was about storytelling. Each spice carried the aroma of distant lands, the labour of countless traders, and the proof that Rome's appetite was as boundless as its conquests. In the glow of a Roman dining room, when a guest inhaled the sharp bite of pepper or the sweetness of cinnamon, they were not only savouring food, They were tasting empire itself. For Romans, food was never just about flavour. It was a performance, and presentation was the stage. Hosts didn't want their guests to merely eat. They wanted them to marvel, to gossip, to remember the spectacle long after the last bite. The art of serving dishes theatrically was as important as the ingredients themselves, and in this, Roman cooks became masters of culinary drama. One favoured trick was disguise. A dish might look like one thing, but reveal itself to be another. Apicius, the celebrated Roman gourmand, described recipes where fish was shaped to resemble birds, or where pastries concealed meats within. A platter of eggs might arrive at the table, only for guests to discover they were filled with spiced meats or honey custard. These illusions delighted audiences, transforming meals into games of wit and surprise. Whole animals were also paraded out for shock value. Peacocks roasted with their feathers reattached shimmered in candlelight, turning dinner into a vision of exotic majesty. Pigs were stuffed with sausages and smaller animals, so that when carved open, they seemed to give birth to an endless stream of meats. In one famous account, a host served an enormous boar with baskets of live thrushes hidden inside. When cut, the birds flew out into the dining room, a living explosion of wealth and absurdity. Even the arrangement of colours and textures mattered. Bright sources of saffron, garum, and wine added vivid contrasts. Silver platters and gilded cups reflected torchlight, making each dish sparkle. Slaves poured wine from ornate amphorae, while musicians struck chords to highlight the unveiling of the next course. Every detail was designed to blur the line between banquet and theatre. These acts of culinary pageantry weren't random. They carried social weight. A host who astonished his guests proved not just his wealth but his creativity and sophistication. To dine at such a table was to participate in a kind of ritual, one that reinforced bonds of loyalty, admiration, and political favour. Eating became a performance of belonging to Rome's elite. For critics, the showmanship bordered on madness. Moralists mocked nobles who spent fortunes on meals designed to amuse more than nourish. Yet for centuries, Romans embraced this theatrical dining, seeing in it a reflection of their empire itself, bold, extravagant, and determined to astonish the world. At a Roman feast, the taste mattered, but the gasp of wonder mattered more. To modern diners, desserts often complete a meal. For the Romans, however, sweetness was not confined to the end. It was scattered throughout their banquets, mingling with savoury courses in ways that might surprise us today. Honey was the backbone of Roman indulgence, the only real sweetener available before sugar arrived centuries later. Sticky, golden, and versatile, it found its way into sauces for meat, glazes for roasted dormice, and syrups for pastries. A Roman feast without honey would have been unthinkable. Roman cooks loved pairing sweetness with contrast. Fish might be drizzled with honey-based sauces, while vegetables like carrots or parsnips could be candied into unexpected treats. Poppy seeds, dates, and figs often accompanied honey, adding texture and richness. The combination of sweet and savoury shocked foreign visitors, but delighted Roman palates, who viewed such mixtures as signs of culinary sophistication. The stranger the pairing, the more impressive the host. Pastries, too, had their place. Layers of thin dough stuffed with nuts and drenched in honey foreshadowed desserts still found around the Mediterranean today. Cheesecakes, sweetened curdled milk dishes, and fruit tarts made appearances at elite tables. Even street vendors offered simple honey cakes, proof that sweetness, while often a luxury, trickled down to the common people in simpler forms. Wine also played a role in Rome's indulgent approach to sweetness. Rarely drunk plain, it was often mixed with honey to create mulsum, a sweet, spiced drink served at the beginning of meals. Spiced wines with cinnamon or cloves further blurred the line between drink and dessert. To sip such concoctions was to taste the wealth of Rome's trade routes, distilled into a single cup. Yet, as with other Roman delicacies, sweetness had symbolic weight. Honeyed dishes represented abundance and prosperity, a signal that a host's resources were overflowing. At Saturnalia, the great winter festival, honey cakes and figs were exchanged as gifts, embodying goodwill and shared indulgence. The elite, however, took the symbolism further, turning every sugary bite into proof of their ability to command luxury. Critics often sneered at this indulgence, arguing that Romans had lost their ancestral simplicity. Still, the fascination with sweetness endured, woven into rituals of both dining and celebration. For the elite reclining at banquets, each honey-soaked morsel was more than a taste. It was a declaration of wealth, refinement, and Rome's endless appetite for pleasure. Not everyone in Rome applauded the endless parade of flamingo tongues, honeyed dormice, and gilded pastries. While the elite reclined in their tricliniums feasting on extravagance, satirists and philosophers sharpened their pens. To them, exotic foods were not symbols of greatness, but symptoms of decadence, proof that Rome had strayed from the virtues that built its empire. Juvenal, the biting satirist, mocked his contemporaries for caring more about peacock dishes than about politics. In his famous phrase, panem et circenses, bread and circuses, he lamented that the people had surrendered their civic spirit for entertainment and indulgence. To him, a society dazzled by flamingo tongues had lost its dignity. Petronius, in his Satyricon, parodied banquets where absurd dishes were presented with pomp, highlighting the emptiness of excess. For readers, his grotesque descriptions of stuffed animals and over-the-top displays rang uncomfortably close to reality. Philosophers like Seneca struck a more sombre tone. The Stoic thinker scorned luxury dining, warning that indulgence weakened discipline and corrupted the soul. He argued that a man who required spices from India or dormice dipped in honey to enjoy life was not free, but enslaved to his own desires. To Seneca, true strength came from simplicity, from finding satisfaction in bread, water, and self-restraint. His critiques painted Rome's elite not as refined hosts, but as fools trapped by their appetites. Even emperors came under fire. Stories circulated of Nero ordering banquets that lasted for days, where dishes of impossible rarity were paraded before guests only to be discarded uneaten. Caligula was rumoured to have fed his horse oats mixed with gold leaf, a gesture that blurred the line between satire and insanity. Such tales, whether exaggerated or true, reflected how closely the public associated food with moral judgment. To eat extravagantly was to invite criticism. For common Romans, the mockery carried an undercurrent of resentment. While the poor lined up for their grain ration, the sight of senators boasting about peacock brains or jellyfish salads reinforced the gulf between classes. Satire became a weapon, giving voice to frustration while ridiculing those who treated food as theatre rather than sustenance. Yet despite the scorn, the feasting continued. Criticism may have pricked consciences, but spectacle was stronger than shame. In the end, Rome's obsession with exotic foods stood as both a marvel and a warning. A culture so wealthy it could turn rodents into delicacies, yet so divided it could laugh and sneer at itself in the same breath. Rome's banquets may have ended centuries ago, but the echoes of their exotic tastes linger in history, shaping how we think about food, luxury, and spectacle. The empire's obsession with rare ingredients and dramatic presentation created a blueprint for elite dining that still resonates in modern kitchens and restaurants. To eat extravagantly, to dazzle guests with the unusual. These are Roman ideas that never truly disappeared. Consider the global spice trade. Rome's appetite for pepper, cinnamon, and silphium set a precedent for linking cuisine with empire. Long after silphium vanished, pepper remained a commodity so valuable that it fueled medieval trade routes and, eventually, voyages of exploration. The Roman hunger for flavour showed the world that food was not only sustenance, but also power, an idea that carried into later empires and into the modern notion of luxury goods. The Roman passion for presentation also survives. The extravagant banquets of the Renaissance, where entire castles of sugar were displayed on noble tables, drew inspiration from ancient Roman theatrics. Even today, fine dining thrives on surprise and spectacle. Whether it is molecular gastronomy, transforming liquids into spheres, or chefs plating dishes designed to astonish. The Roman instinct to make food into art is alive in every Michelin-starred performance of cuisine. Yet Rome's culinary legacy is not only one of extravagance. It is also a cautionary tale. Ancient critics like Seneca and Juvenal warned that indulgence eroded virtue and widened the gulf between rich and poor. Modern societies, too, grapple with similar questions. How much of luxury is enrichment, and how much is excess? The Roman elite's obsession with status foods reminds us that cuisine can both unite and divide, delight and corrupt. Perhaps the most enduring legacy is psychological. To the Romans, food was identity. To serve dormice glazed in honey or flamingo tongues was not merely eccentric, it was a declaration of power, reach, and refinement. Today, people may not eat peacock brains, but they still post photos of rare wines, truffle pastas, or exotic sushi as status symbols. The instinct is the same, to use food as proof of belonging to a world of wealth or sophistication. In the end, Rome's exotic tastes tell us as much about human nature as about history. We hunger not only for food, but for meaning, for recognition, for the thrill of tasting something rare. Rome perfected that hunger, turning it into theatre. And though the empire fell, the appetite it revealed has never gone away. Marcus Aurelius was born on April 26, 121 CE, into a noble but not overwhelmingly powerful Roman family. His father, Marcus Annius Verus, came from a respected Spanish lineage that had risen in Roman politics, but his life was cut short when Marcus was only 3 years old. This early loss left the boy in the care of his mother, Domitia Lucilla, a wealthy woman of strong character, and his grandfather, who guided his upbringing with the seriousness befitting Rome's aristocracy. From the very beginning, Marcus was immersed in an environment that combined privilege with responsibility. What set Marcus apart, even as a child, was his temperament. While other boys chased games in the streets, Marcus preferred quiet contemplation. He was drawn to philosophy at an unusually young age, adopting a seriousness beyond his years. Emperor Hadrian, an admirer of intellectual talent, took notice of the boy. Observing his calm demeanour and sharp mind, Hadrian began to call him Verissimus, the most truthful, a name that captured the integrity and gravity that Marcus would carry throughout his life. As a teenager, Marcus was introduced to Stoicism, the philosophy that would shape his destiny. He embraced its emphasis on self-control, reason, and acceptance of fate. He began to practice sleeping on the floor, wearing simple cloaks and denying himself luxuries, even though he lived in the comfort of Rome's upper class. These early exercises in austerity prepared him for the burdens that would one day rest on his shoulders. He wasn't rehearsing for pleasure or power. He was rehearsing for duty. Hadrian's successor, Antoninus Pius, recognized Marcus's promise and adopted him as his son and heir, binding Marcus's fate to the throne of Rome. Suddenly, the boy who once studied philosophy in quiet gardens was thrust into the line of succession. His childhood, though marked by privilege, had instilled in him the understanding that life was fragile, uncertain, and demanding. Every lesson he absorbed, every hardship he endured, sharpened his conviction that leadership was not a prize, but a responsibility. By the time Marcus reached adulthood, his character was already formed, disciplined, thoughtful, and grounded in philosophy. He was no ordinary youth of Rome, chasing pleasure and spectacle. He was, from the very beginning, a boy destined for duty, a philosopher in the making, who would one day rule the greatest empire in the world. When Emperor Hadrian's health began to fail, he searched for a successor who could secure the empire's future. His choice fell not directly on Marcus Aurelius, who was still a boy, but on Antoninus Pius, a steady and reliable senator. Yet Hadrian added a condition. Antoninus must adopt Marcus and another youth, Lucius Verus, as his heirs. In that moment, Marcus's life path was sealed. He would not simply be a philosopher, he was destined to rule. Antoninus Pius became both father and mentor to Marcus, shaping him into an emperor in waiting. Known for his mild character and careful governance, Antoninus offered Marcus a model of restraint and duty. Instead of plunging into wars or lavish spectacles, Antoninus ruled with quiet diligence, and Marcus absorbed every lesson. This was the kind of emperor Stoicism demanded, calm, patient, and deeply conscious of responsibility, yet being heir to the empire was not without pressure. Marcus was pulled between two worlds, the disciplined, ascetic life of philosophy and the glittering, often corrupt world of imperial politics. Senators flattered him, courtiers observed him, and the eyes of Rome weighed on his every gesture. Still, he held fast to his studies. Tutors in rhetoric and philosophy trained him, but it was the Stoics, Epictetus and his successors, who truly shaped his inner compass. He learned that power is fleeting, that fortune is unstable, and that a man must govern himself before he can govern others. His betrothal to Faustina, Antoninus's daughter, further tied him to the imperial family. Their marriage symbolized continuity, linking Marcus not only by adoption, but by blood into Rome's ruling dynasty. Together, they would have many children, though the fragility of life in antiquity meant that not all would survive. For Marcus, each loss would later echo in his writings, where the Stoic call to accept fate was not abstract philosophy, but lived reality. By the time Antoninus's long reign drew to a close, Marcus was more than prepared. For decades, he had studied, observed, and practiced the principles of leadership. He had learned patience from Antoninus, philosophy from his teachers, and duty from the weight of expectation. When the day came for him to assume the purple, the boy who once slept on the floor to harden himself for Stoic discipline was ready to take the throne, not as a seeker of glory, but as a servant of Rome. When Antoninus Pius died in 161 CE, Marcus Aurelius ascended to the throne, not with pomp and arrogance, but with a heavy sense of obligation. True to the terms of Hadrian's succession plan, he ruled jointly with his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, the first time Rome had two emperors. Marcus, however, was clearly the senior partner, the philosopher king, whose mind was as much in the realm of ideas as in the affairs of state. Unlike many of his predecessors, Marcus had no thirst for luxury or conquest. He viewed imperial power through the lens of Stoicism, as a duty, not a prize. To him, the throne was an opportunity to live his philosophy on the grandest stage possible. "Do not waste the remainder of your life," he would later write in Meditations, "wondering what others think of you." These were not words for the ivory tower. They were reflections born from the burdens of ruling the most powerful empire in the world. Marcus sought balance between governance and contemplation. He surrounded himself with capable advisors, relying on their counsel rather than indulging in absolute whim. He kept his household modest compared to imperial standards, refusing to let extravagance erode his discipline. His evenings, when duties allowed, were devoted to reading and writing, often in Greek, the language of philosophy. In his private reflections, he reminded himself to remain humble, to see beyond the flattery of courtiers, and to remember that emperors, too, were mortal. His partnership with Lucius Verus tested his principles. Lucius enjoyed luxuries, games, and the trappings of power that Marcus disdained. Yet Marcus bore with his co-ruler patiently, practicing the Stoic art of endurance. Even when Lucius faltered in his responsibilities, Marcus did not openly condemn him, preferring harmony over discord. His restraint kept Rome from fracturing at the top. Still, Marcus's reign was no peaceful meditation. From the start, crises pressed upon him. Wars in the east, threats along the Danube, and plagues that devastated the population. But it was precisely in these moments that Marcus's philosophy proved most vital. While others might have panicked or despaired, he returned again and again to the Stoic truths he had learned as a boy. That life is fleeting, that fortune is fickle, and that the only true possession a man has is the virtue of his own character. Thus began the paradox of Marcus Aurelius, a ruler who was at once warrior and philosopher, forced to wield the sword while forever searching for inner peace. The reign of Marcus Aurelius, though remembered for philosophy, was consumed by war. The empire's vast borders were constantly tested, and Marcus, whether he desired it or not, became as much a general as a thinker. Almost immediately after taking power, the Parthian Empire struck in the east, threatening Rome's provinces. While Marcus remained in Rome to stabilize government, his co-emperor Lucius Verus led the campaign, supported by seasoned generals. The war was long and brutal, but ultimately Rome triumphed, pushing back Parthian advances and reaffirming control. Victory, however, brought new troubles. Soldiers returning from the east carried with them a mysterious plague, likely smallpox, that swept through the empire, killing millions. It devastated towns, farms, and legions alike. For Marcus, this was not just a logistical crisis, but a test of his philosophy. He could not prevent death from striking his people, but he could remain calm, fair, and unshaken in the face of tragedy. Even as Rome reeled from disease, new dangers erupted along the northern frontier. Germanic tribes, emboldened by Rome's weakness, poured across the Danube. The Marcomanni, Quadi, and other tribes threatened to break into Italy itself, a danger not seen since the days of the early Republic. Marcus had no choice. He left the comfort of Rome and took personal command of the legions. For much of his reign, he lived not in marble palaces but in military camps along the frontier. There he endured the same hardships as his soldiers: cold winters, poor food, and the constant uncertainty of battle. Far from resenting this, Marcus embraced it as a Stoic exercise. He saw war as another arena in which to practice virtue, patience, courage, and justice. He rewarded discipline, punished corruption, and led by example. His troops admired him for his fairness, even when campaigns dragged on year after year. The frontier wars became the defining struggle of his reign. Though victories came, they were hard-won, and peace was always temporary. Yet Marcus never abandoned his sense of duty. He saw himself not as a conqueror, but as a guardian, holding the line so that Rome could endure. For an emperor who preferred books to battlefields, the irony was stark. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher, became Marcus Aurelius, the warrior, and yet, in the clash of swords and the smoke of campfires, he found the very stage on which his stoic ideals would be tested most severely. Amid the clamour of war, Marcus Aurelius created his most enduring legacy, not in marble, but in words. In the freezing camps along the Danube, between battles against Germanic tribes, he wrote what would later be called the Meditations. These private notes, penned in Greek, were never meant for public eyes. They were reminders to himself, exercises in clarity, and anchors of philosophy in the storm of leadership. The Meditations are not polished essays or political proclamations. They are raw, almost intimate reflections, little notebooks for the soul, as some have called them. In them, Marcus wrestled with questions that remain universal. How should a man face death? How can one act justly when surrounded by corruption? How does one endure suffering without bitterness? His answers always circled back to Stoicism. Accept what you cannot change, control your mind, act with virtue, and remember that all things are fleeting. What makes the Meditations so remarkable is the context. These were not the musings of a scholar in a library, but the thoughts of an emperor burdened by plague, rebellion, and war. He could have drowned in despair, or grasped for luxury to escape reality. Instead, he turned inward, using philosophy not as ornament, but as survival. The Meditations became his shield against anger, fear, and hopelessness. Passages reveal his constant struggle against ego. Do not waste time arguing what a good man should be. Be one, he wrote. For a ruler with absolute power, this was more than rhetoric. It was discipline. He reminded himself daily not to be corrupted by praise, not to be hardened by cruelty, and not to forget that emperors, like peasants, are dust in the end. Ironically, the words he never intended to publish outlived every decree he issued. The Meditations travelled through time, copied, translated, and cherished by generations seeking wisdom. Soldiers, monks, philosophers, and even modern leaders have found guidance in Marcus's quiet notes. On the frontier, by the flicker of lamplight in a tent, Marcus Aurelius was both emperor and student, ruler of men, yet servant of philosophy. The empire he guarded would eventually fall, but his Meditations endure, offering humanity a timeless reminder that true strength is not in conquest or crowns, but in mastering oneself. Behind the emperor's calm, stoic mask lay a life marked by personal trials. Marcus Aurelius married Faustina the Younger, daughter of Antoninus Pius, soon after being named heir. Their marriage bound him firmly to the imperial family, but it also brought both joy and heartache. Together, they had at least 13 children, yet in an age of high infant mortality, many did not survive into adulthood. Each death cut deeply into Marcus's heart, testing his stoic resolve. His writings in Meditations often remind himself to accept death as part of nature's cycle, but behind those words was the grief of a father burying his own children. Faustina herself was a controversial figure. Ancient sources alternately praise her loyalty and accuse her of infidelity. Gossip whispered through Rome that she consorted with gladiators or soldiers, rumours likely fuelled by her independence and visibility as empress. Marcus, however, never allowed such stories to shake his devotion. He honoured her with titles, travelled with her on campaign, and upon her death in 175 CE, he deified her, an unmistakable sign of his affection and respect. Whatever others said to Marcus, she remained his steadfast partner. Family burdens extended beyond his immediate household. As emperor, he was responsible for securing the succession of Rome itself. Among his surviving children, one stood out, Commodus. Marcus placed enormous hope in preparing his son for leadership. Yet even during Commodus's youth, there were signs of a different temperament, restless, indulgent, and prone to excess. Marcus, the philosopher king, must have sensed the uneasy contrast, but duty required him to look ahead and secure continuity. His choice to name Commodus as heir would become one of the most debated decisions of his reign, casting a shadow over his legacy. Personal struggles also included the crushing loneliness of command. Marcus often wrote of the need to rise above bitterness, to forgive, and to endure without complaint. But his philosophy was not detachment from humanity. It was an effort to remain humane despite grief, betrayal, and the harsh realities of rule. His family life, with its joys and its sorrows, reminded him daily of the stoic truth he cherished most, that nothing is permanent, not even the bonds of blood. Thus, even as he governed the largest empire on earth, Marcus Aurelius remained a man acquainted with loss, love, and the constant challenge of balancing duty with the fragile intimacies of family. No emperor chooses the crises of his reign, and for Marcus Aurelius, they arrived in relentless succession. The Antonine Plague, which swept across the empire beginning in the late 160s CE, was among the deadliest in Roman history. Likely smallpox, it spread with terrifying speed, carried home by soldiers returning from the Parthian campaign. Cities emptied, farms lay fallow, and legions weakened as disease cut through every class of society. At its height, the plague may have killed millions, nearly a tenth of the empire's population. For Marcus, this was not just a logistical nightmare, but a moral test. How could he hold together a people ravaged by fear and loss? He turned to the stoic principles that had guided him since youth: accept what cannot be controlled, and act justly with what remains. He organised relief where possible, supported orphans of plague victims, and tried to keep the economy functioning despite the collapse of manpower. Unlike rulers who might have hidden from the suffering, Marcus stayed visible, sharing in the hardships of his people and refusing to let despair define his reign. Yet plague was not his only trial. In 175 CE, while Marcus was still struggling to hold the northern frontier, a revolt erupted closer to home. Avidius Cassius, governor of Syria and a respected general, declared himself emperor after receiving false reports that Marcus had died. The rebellion spread quickly across the eastern provinces, threatening to fracture the empire at its core. Marcus's response was measured, almost astonishingly calm. He did not lash out with vengeance, but prepared to march east, ready to negotiate if bloodshed could be avoided. Fortune intervened before confrontation was necessary. Cassius was assassinated by his own officers after only a few months of rebellion. When Marcus arrived, instead of punishing Cassius's supporters, he pardoned many of them, seeking reconciliation rather than revenge. It was a striking contrast to emperors who used rebellion as an excuse for purges. These twin crises, plague and revolt, revealed the heart of Marcus Aurelius's rule. He was not a conqueror hungry for glory, nor a tyrant eager for cruelty. He was a ruler who endured, who sought stability in chaos, and who believed that the truest strength lay not in destroying enemies, but in governing oneself with wisdom and restraint. By the late 170s CE, Marcus Aurelius was an emperor, worn down by years of war, plague, and sorrow. His body, once hardened by stoic discipline and the rigours of military campaigns, began to show the strain. The harsh winters along the Danube, the endless travel, and the grief of losing children had left him frail. Yet even as his strength declined, his sense of duty did not. He continued to lead armies against the Germanic tribes, refusing to abandon the frontier to chaos. The Marcomannic Wars dragged on, testing Rome's endurance. Victories came, but never decisively enough to end the conflict. Marcus envisioned stabilizing the Danube frontier permanently by annexing new provinces, ensuring Rome's security for generations. But the constant drain of men and resources, worsened by the plague's devastation, made his ambitions increasingly difficult. Even so, he pressed forward, believing that his personal presence was essential to maintaining the morale of both his troops and his people. Physically weakened, Marcus leaned more heavily on philosophy. His meditations during these years often reflect on mortality with increasing urgency. He reminded himself that death is natural, that every man, emperor or slave, must yield to time. "You could leave life right now," he wrote, a sober acknowledgement that his days were numbered. Yet rather than despair, he sought clarity. If life was fleeting, then every action must be guided by justice and virtue, not by fear. His family life added further weight to his declining years. Commodus, his only surviving son, was growing into manhood, but his temperament alarmed many. Where Marcus was disciplined, Commodus was indulgent. Where Marcus sought wisdom, Commodus craved pleasure. The emperor knew that succession could not be left to chance, and despite doubts, he named Commodus his heir. It was a decision born not of confidence, but of necessity. Rome needed continuity, even if its next ruler lacked his father's restraint. By 180 CE, Marcus was visibly fading. His face, once calm but firm, was now gaunt, and his health deteriorated rapidly as he campaigned in present-day Austria. Yet he remained with his soldiers to the end, refusing to abandon the frontier. He had spent his reign enduring crises with patience, and now, as his strength declined, he prepared to face the final crisis of every man, the inevitability of death. In March of 180 CE, while still on campaign near Vindobona, modern Vienna, or possibly Sirmium in the Balkans, Marcus Aurelius's long endurance finally ended. Stricken with illness, likely the lingering Antonine plague, he summoned his advisors, and above all, his son Commodus. The philosopher-emperor, who had carried the burdens of empire for nearly 2 decades, prepared himself for death with the same calm he had brought to life. For Marcus, dying was not a tragedy, but a natural act, the final harmony in nature's rhythm. Ancient sources tell us he faced his end with serenity. He is said to have consoled his weeping soldiers by reminding them that death comes to all, emperor or commoner alike. For a man who had spent years meditating on mortality, the moment was not unexpected but accepted. His final words, though reported in different forms, capture his lifelong devotion to philosophy. Urging Commodus to remember the responsibilities of rule, and reminding those around him that virtue, not power, defines a man. With his passing, Rome lost more than an emperor. It lost the embodiment of a rare ideal. Marcus Aurelius had lived not as a tyrant, but as a servant of duty. He was a ruler who endured plague, rebellion, and endless war, yet never allowed cruelty or vanity to govern his choices. His reign was not marked by conquest or spectacle, but by perseverance, holding the empire together when it could easily have fractured. His death, however, also marked a turning point. Commodus, his only surviving son, inherited the throne, and his rule would prove disastrous. Self-indulgent, erratic, and cruel, Commodus dismantled much of what his father had preserved. Many historians see Marcus's greatest failure in naming Commodus as heir, yet even this reflects the constraints of Roman politics. The dynasty required continuity, and Marcus, weakened and weary, chose stability over risk. Still, his personal legacy far outlived the empire's political decline. His meditations survived through centuries, inspiring monks, scholars, soldiers, and modern thinkers alike. In those quiet words, scribbled in tents and on campaigns, the true Marcus lives on, not as emperor, but as a man searching for wisdom in a chaotic world. Marcus Aurelius's life reminds us that leadership is not measured in glory but in resilience, and that even in the most brutal of times, one can live with calm, compassion, and inner peace. The warrior emperor died, but the philosopher endures.